does appear that there's been a safe space in the West now created for all the anti-Western forces, and they've never been as overt and open about it as they are now. Why is that the case? It may well be that you have cowed Western leaders that we did not have, certainly in America, for the last 4 years. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, from my vantage point in America, is that you have the upper rungs of an administration that essentially subscribe to the same worldview. That's maybe the most disturbing thing of all. It's not just campus radicals, that those campus radicals have matriculated to the heights of political power, to the heights of cultural power, certainly corporate power in certain instances as well. But if you look, the National Security Council in America, which is the chief national security advisory arm to the president, the head of intelligence at NSC here was a pro-BDS activist in college. We've probably talked about Rob Malley in the past before, but Rob Malley was the senior State Department envoy to Iran trying to execute an Iran deal 2.0. It appears Rob Malley led an Iranian spy ring. One of the people we brought in to that spy ring still works in a senior position at the Department of Defense. So more disturbing is that the campus radicals have all graduated in or been brought into the heights of political power. Obviously, you mentioned, of course, the likes of the Squad, and we've talked about Ilhan Omar before, and my book on Ilhan Omar, American Ingrate, foretold all of this. It suggested that this was the future, if not the present, of the Democrat Party. It certainly played out that way. But to your point, when you take already the virulent Jew hatred and anti-Western views that prevailed on college campuses, and then you have mass immigration from Islamic countries to the West, and all you have to do is look at the polling in those countries to show that the Jew hatred is disproportionate in virtually every country in the Middle East and beyond. And we can talk about what the roots of the Jew hatred are, and is it based in the Islamic canon or not? It doesn't really matter. We don't have to have that academic argument. The fact of the matter is, disproportionately in the Muslim world, there is Jew hatred. And if you were going to import wide swaths of the Muslim world, well, you would hope that a decent percentage of those people would be those trying to flee the maladies and the pathologies of that world. Of course, enemies are going to take advantage of our liberalism when it comes to immigration, and people are going to come over with the beliefs that they held there. There's a reason why the Middle East looks the way the Middle East does, and there's a reason that Switzerland looks the way Switzerland does, or Mexico looks the way it does. Different peoples are different. We hold deep and dear different ideas. We're animated by different drives. And so consequently, you add it all up, and it's a very poisonous and toxic mix here in the West. The US, and probably to an extent as well, Canada, we're blessed by our geography that we haven't necessarily had as big mass immigration from the Islamic world as you've had wars throughout the Middle East. But certainly Western Europe is not the Western Europe that it was. It is a different place today. And in some cases, the irony here is that we hear about occupation. Well, in some ways, it's the West that's really increasingly occupied.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the map of Islam itself by decade, by century, Islam is a colonizing. I mean, it's a religion, it's a political way of life, but it's also a military doctrine. The Quran is a military document as well as other things. Let me just ask you one question. You mentioned Joe Biden. In some ways, he said the right things. I remember his first visit to Israel shortly after the October 7th attacks, and I was extremely nervous because you could see he was wobbly and sleepy, and who knows how much, but he managed to get through it without saying something disastrous, I think. On the one hand, I look at the two aircraft carrier groups in the region, and I think, okay, that's to make sure Turkey or Iran don't start something, I guess. But I also thought, well, maybe that's there to keep Israel tamped down. I don't know. Can you help me understand? You say that Joe Biden has said one thing and done another thing. What has Joe Biden done that has been, I mean, other than his support for Iran? I understand they released billions of dollars more for Iran, actually, in recent weeks. What has Joe Biden done that has undermined Israel? Because at least rhetorically, there have been some moments that I thought, well, that's better than I thought it would be. What has he done to undermine Israel in actions?
Yeah, so I've long suggested that there is something of a bear hug going on, which was something that Barack Obama tried to do. He said, well, we have military relations with Israel, and we're going to provide Israel aid, and we're going to basically suffocate Israel with that aid to force it into accepting an Iran deal. We're going to leak information to undermine Israel's military operations to try and neutralize Iran, but we're going to cover it up by saying we're best friends and we have massive aid and the Iron Dome you can see as a testament to it, etc. There's a similar ruse that's being played with Joe Biden. As you note, the rhetoric at times suggests stalwart support. On the other hand, there was a $14 billion military aid bill, which Republicans passed through the House to delink spending associated with the war in Israel, military spending, from Ukrainian spending and a whole amalgam of other appropriations. Biden said he would veto it outright. They said it was the Republicans were being political by trying to do this $14 billion, which would be taken away from IRS agents harassing Americans, essentially. Democrats shot it down in the Senate, wouldn't vote on it. Joe Biden won't even have a chance to veto it. But if you want to talk broad strokes, here are the real distinctive items, in my view. I agree, by the way, that carriers being brought in is actually made to deter Israel, not to deter Iran and other powers in the region. And by the way, you can see that because Iran and its proxies have executed dozens of attacks on U.S. military facilities and personnel in the region with barely a response from this administration. But the micromanaging of Israel's response is really the proof in the pudding, as I see it. The Biden administration has really, from the start, whispered about ceasefires, continues to try and push so-called ceasefires, and for Israel to permit quote-unquote humanitarian aid, which in reality, of course, means resupplying and refueling Hamas, providing it cover and time to recuperate, to strengthen so that it can withstand Israel's attack. Let's not forget, Israel was not allowed, not permitted, essentially by the U.S., to engage in any sort of ground offensive. For weeks, it gave Hamas time to prepare. The Biden administration has said explicitly, Israel, you are not to ultimately annex parts of or otherwise control Gaza. There needs to be an international force the day after the war ends. The Biden administration has been very tough on Israel in terms of you ought not to strike Hezbollah or other Iranian proxies in the region outside of Gaza. Also, the Biden administration continues to talk about the imperative for a two-state solution, which should be a laughable and a laughably offensive proposition after you're talking about the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Then you want to give the Palestinian Authority control over Gaza, a Palestinian Authority, by the way, which itself has excused the attacks and denies essentially the attacks that Hamas committed. And then if you look at the polling of Palestinian Arabs, overwhelmingly, 3/4 plus were overjoyed by Hamas's disgusting raping, jihadism, massacring of people, etc., hostage taking, etc. So you add these points up, the micromanaging of the effort, the seeking to restrain Israel and force it to comport itself the way the U.S. wants, constantly invoking the fact that Israel has to abide by the laws of war. We're talking about a force that provides its enemies with more protections, the civilians around enemies, with more protections than any fighting force probably in the history of mankind, and has done so, by the way, in Gaza in trying to allow the Palestinian Arabs to leave northern Gaza and go south before the offensive really took off. In every single dimension, there's been pressure. Last but not least, and obviously we can talk about the fact that the U.S. continues to cultivate these friendly relations with Qatar when Qatar is harboring Hamas's leaders. We can talk about the unfreezing of the billions of dollars to Iran. We can talk about the Biden administration's delinking explicitly of Iran from Hamas's attacks, essentially serving as mouthpieces for Iran, protecting it and its public relations image. Beyond all that, there's a whispering campaign, and it's come out, of course, in major publications, major U.S. publications, of the Biden administration talking about how they're really looking towards the next Israeli leader to execute this effort. And maybe Bibi isn't long for this effort. In the middle of wartime, after an existential crisis, You're going to have a whispering campaign where you're going to try to shove aside Benjamin Netanyahu, the wartime leader there. Is that something that an ally and a friend does? Then we could talk on the home front about the fact that the Biden administration, when you have the biggest rise in anti-Semitism and Jew hatred that we've seen probably in modern era in America, and what's the focus of the administration? They call for a working group or something even more formal than that on Islamophobia. That's the real issue at hand in America. So you put all of these pieces together. Last but not least, just before we came to record this, over the weekend, the Biden administration put out a memo to its cabinet talking about how they would like to impose sanctions on quote unquote settlers in the West Bank, i.e. Judea and Samaria. Part of those sanctions on quote unquote the violent Israeli extremists there is that sanctions can be slapped on you and no visa permitted for an individual to the extent they are an impediment essentially to a quote unquote two-state solution. So if you're an Israeli wrong thinker now, essentially the Biden administration wants to criminalize your wrong think. Add all of these pieces up, and the notion that this administration has Israel's back falls by the wayside. We will see what kinds of strings become attached when it comes to weapons sales and other military support as Israel's operation goes on, but there's already been word that there are serious strings attached. All of this points to not a friend, but someone seeking to restrain Israel to maintain the status quo of making Iran the strong horse in the Middle East to the detriment of the Western world.